Good morning,
Morning.
and welcome to this second part of this morning's program. And this program, as Catherine Ann mentioned, this is going to be a dialogue on Dharma and Torah. It's a Buddhist-Jewish dialogue. Yesterday we had a dialogue between the Buddhist and Christian traditions, or Thursday actually. And this is such an honor for our venerable monks to be with Rabbi David Ingber. It's really one of the programs, one of the aspects of our human, interaction. His Holiness the Dalai Lama so much values. He talks about three main focuses in his life. Number one, he is a human being, one of the 7 billion citizens of this world. Therefore, his first priority is to promote basic human values. Values like loving kindness, what we were led to into meditation earlier this morning by Lexi. We have values like compassion, empathy, understanding, generosity, respect for each other. These are the values that His Holiness talks about, the foundation for our human flourishing and survival. And therefore, he says that he is a human being before he is a Buddhist. For him, promoting basic human values is more important than promoting Buddhist values, the specific Buddhist values, if you will. Because Buddhist values at the foundation, like Jewish values, the Christian values, the human values, it must include those basic human values of love, compassion, kindness, caring for each other. Because without this, humanity would not survive. So therefore, he has made the promotion of basic human values as the number one priority in his life. Now, it's in this context that he also then interacts with many, many different people, including scientists, that educationists, psychologists, politicians, all people from all walks of life, to just better understand our human condition. And he has promoted this dialogue between science and spirituality, not necessarily Buddhism only, science and spirituality. Because he sees that what we need today is the promotion of basic human values, those basic spiritual values, if you will. And it's in this context that he has encouraged, on the one hand, the scientists to study, various contemplative aspects, contemplative practices, and then see their impact on our body, in the brain, and the health, and so forth. But at the same time, he has also encouraged his monastics, monks and nuns in Tibetan Buddhist tradition, to embrace modern science, bring this into their core curriculum. And for the last several years, Emory University, with the partnership with the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives in Dharamsala, Emory has been involved in creating a curriculum, comprehensive curriculum in modern science, and to have implemented this in the monastic core curriculum. It is for 6 years they did the pilot, and since 2014 these programs have been incorporated in the core curriculum in three major monastic universities. And it's in that context, actually, this year we're having a conference called Emory Tibet Symposium, Bridging Buddhism and Science for Mutual Enrichment, like that. That's going to be at Drepung Loseling Monastery. This is the monastery where with over 3,000 monks in India. But Drepung Loseling is a college, one of the colleges of Drepung Monastic University. And Drepung Monastic University itself was founded in 1416, so it's celebrating 600 years this year. So it's coinciding with 600 year celebration is going to be this symposium, and the Loseling Monastery has, in order to kind of advance and to contribute to His Holiness's this endeavor in promoting basic human values and collaboration between science and Buddhism, has dedicated to create a center for science and meditation, dedicated to advancing His Holiness the Dalai Lama's vision for convergence of science and spirituality. And as Lexi mentioned earlier, that there are some brochures out there. The monks are traveling along other purposes, promoting peace and so forth, but also creating some foundations for where such dialogues, collaborations, interactions can take place. So this is the center they are creating in South India. Any support the monks will very much appreciate. If you are in the position to assist, we really appreciate that. Second focus of His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been the inter-religious understanding. And this, he says that on this earth, of the 7 billion or so people, 6 billion or so have some form of spiritual affiliation, religious affiliation. So of the 6 billion of people, if we live without understanding each other, without respect for without not understanding each other, promotes kind of suspicion and so forth. So that's the source of, unfortunately, sometimes it becomes the source of conflict, as we are seeing now. That among certain kind of very narrow minded group of people like the ISIS and that's what's happening. So His Holiness for long actually has dedicated his life to promoting religious harmony. And in that context, he has met many rabbis, the priests, gurus, the Hindu gurus, and of all religious traditions. In fact, there has been a kind of running secret among the people who coordinate His Holiness the Dalai Lama's visits in the West, that if you really want him to come, commit to come to your organization, that you must organize an interreligious dialogue, that he would not be able to say no, because this is so important for him. So, and so that's why that I think that dialogue like this is really important. I mean, His Holiness engages at a certain level, that the venerable monks can engage in a certain level, but we need to, every one of us, I think that those who belong to certain spiritual traditions, I think it's wonderful for us to understand each other. So there is a respect. What happened with His Holiness. I mean, His Holiness has so much respect for all the major religious traditions. It comes from him engaging in dialogue, spending time sharing the practices and so forth. So that's why he can truly, from the depth of his heart, truly can say that all major religious traditions are very important, equally important for our human survival. So, so we are really happy that Rabbi David Ingber is here to participate in this. And the third focus His Holiness talks about, that he's as a Tibetan, and that where Tibetan people have kind of invested so much hope in him, that it becomes incumbent on him to work for the well-being of Tibetans. And as the leader for Tibetans, he has been working tirelessly through nonviolent means, through dialogue, to resolve the Tibet issue all these years. So that's the third focus. But today, for the second focus, so my role is here to kind of to moderate a little bit, not so much moderate, but to really to interpret for the monks and for Rabbi Ingber, as they have the conversation. I will, of course, participate in some, if there are certain questions, directly that involves me, I will participate in that. Thank you. So please, floor is for you now.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. First of all, I want to say that it's a real honor to be here and to be sitting with representatives of a tradition that I've been personally in an interior dialogue with for 20 years. And to, first of all, to thank the Aspen Chapel and to thank the Aspen Jewish community, particularly to Rabbi David Siegel and to Cantor Rollins Simmons and to Jason. Thank you so much for supporting this, and to Lexi for making it happen, and for the space that the Aspen Chapel has offered for this dialogue to take place. It was a really fruitful dialogue with Nicholas on Thursday. And for those of you who were here, it was illuminating, it was rich, it was compelling, it was and entertaining too. It was all things. So let me begin by saying that Shabbat Shalom. And also to teach, I want to teach my friends here, can we say Shabbat Shalom? Beautiful, which means Shabbat Shalom, which means peaceful, a peaceful day of rest. And to begin Shabbat with Shalom, with peace, and that deep chant about Shalom, which is peace. It's a really beautiful way to start Shabbat, so thank you very much. My own personal story is that I grew up in an Orthodox home in New York. My upbringing was very religious, and but kind of, sort of, in a dialogue with American culture, I was very modern. And what that meant was that I was a little bit compromised religiously growing up. It was more American than Jewish. But my family was Orthodox, very traditional. And when I went to Israel in 1987 as an 18-year-old, I became an ultra-Orthodox Jew that lasted about 6 years. So I was in the black hat, I had the curly cues, I had the whole paraphernalia, I had the whole thing going on. And when I left that world, I left completely. I left Judaism for a decade. And what sustained me during those 10 years, first with yoga, with integral yoga in New York, and the teachings of Satchitananda and Muktananda, and eventually making my way to Thich Nhat Hanh and to Zen practice, and eventually also to Tibetan chanting and Tibetan Sangha. And Buddhism, in some ways, there was a great rabbi, and his name was Pinchas of Koretz. He was in the 18th century. He said that had it not been for the mystical book of the Zohar, he would not have been Jewish, that he needed mysticism to bring him back to Judaism. And I actually like to say, had it not been for the Buddha, I wouldn't be Jewish. Had it not been for the Buddha, I would not have known that Judaism, God bless you, could have been not just an identity, not just a culture, and not just something that you did a couple of times a year, but it could be a full practice. That Judaism offered a way in to what the Buddha called nibbana or nirvana, or the cessation, the extinguishing of the crazy mind, the fire mind, the mind that is always on fire. So my re-engagement with Judaism in 2003 through Reb Zalman, my teacher, was a re-entry into the world of Judaism as practice. Judaism as not just creed or idea, but practice. And what is it pointing towards? And so last point I want to make, or the last invitation, is to invite into the room the presence of my teacher, Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who had a very fruitful dialogue with the Dalai Lama and a group of Jews who went to India, captured in a book called The Jew and the Lotus. And I think that my Rebbe, my teacher, my guru, my heart, is still in dialogue in so many ways with this beautiful tradition. So I want to begin by asking the monks, I want to begin by asking you. In our tradition, the Jewish mystical tradition, we say that we would like to live in the world as if the whole world were God. The idea that the world and God are not separate, or that God isn't a thing amongst other things. That when we say God exists, that's actually not true. To say God exists is to borrow language from other things that exist. To say God exists and to say this table exists is to put them both in a category of existence which is unfair. So it's probably better to say God doesn't exist, or to say God is existence itself. So the parallels for that in Buddhism, I imagine, are emptiness and form. I don't know if anybody would like to speak to that, the relationship between when Buddhism says that it is atheistic or agnostic, really. The Buddha was famously saying, don't ask me about whether God exists. That's not my question. My question is suffering and the cessation of suffering. But when Buddhism became metaphysical, deeply metaphysical, it said that all things are empty. Is that similar to saying that all things don't exist, or that all things are, right, suchness, all things are God? Is it similar? Is it different? What would you say?
This is actually the Geshe Lobsang. He is the head of the monks on the tour, leading along with the Geshe Lobsang, who serves as the spokesperson for the monastery. First of all, that the question is a really profound, and whenever it involves like the God or some ultimate, of course, as you mentioned, in Buddhist tradition also, the ultimate is something that cannot be easily captured in the conceptual kind of framework or in the words, and that's why when referring to the ultimate reality, it's at the masam jume, meaning that this is something, ultimate reality transcends the language and conceptual framework. So it's a beyond expression and thinking. And it is true that when Buddha himself is said to have attained the full awakened state, for Buddhists, obviously, there is the concept of the God as a creator, that whether kind of infused with the world or separately, I mean, that the concept of God as a sole creator, that concept actually in the Buddhist, Buddhist tradition doesn't have that.
Right.
But when you present the God as something that expresses in the world, but also you can't affirm, in affirmative terms, you can't say that this is God. That would be actually doing away with the God. Similarly, the emptiness, the ultimate reality is like that. That you can't express. When Buddha attained enlightenment, Buddhahood, in Buddhism, like so if there is a being or the beings who have attained the highest level of awakening, that is the Buddhahood, awakening. When he attained enlightenment, he made this expression that he said that this substitute is said too much. He said that this profound peace beyond any elaboration. That means that you can't say this or that. Beyond, beyond any elaboration. To yourself, the clear light, inborn. It's not created. It's inborn. This ambrosia-like or the nectar-like reality is what I have tasted or I have realized here. But if I were to share with others, nobody at the moment will relate to it because you can't tell exactly what you are experiencing. So therefore he said that, let me wander in the wilderness for a while. And it took 49 days for him to figure out, or I mean, not to figure out, in one way, let's say figure out, but to put it, what he realized in a certain kind of framework that he can teach others, and that's what he called the Four Noble Truths. And then when it comes to the Four Noble Truths, cessation of the suffering has to do with actualizing that reality. And that reality is emptiness, as you mentioned, emptiness is not separate from form, as he says in the essence of the wisdom discourse or the sutra. He says that form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is no other than emptiness, emptiness is no other than form. So there are, absolutely a lot of, on that level, you can say that ultimate is inexpressible in a way. That seems very similar.
So, given that I also, I know we have a lot of questions and we've only done one question so far, and so, and I also want to give a taste of what Jewish mysticism, and also in this dialogue, and the similarities, because there are so many profound similarities to this last point, which is, and also the contemporary scene, what's happening here in America and why Buddhism is so powerful here in America, as we've seen a decrease in affiliation with, what would say, Western traditions, is the focus on a non-theistic spiritual practice that actually improves your life. Do this and see this, the science of meditation, the power of contemplative practice to actually show results. Right? You can actually look at the fruits of your labor. And I just wanted to add, by way of a comment and then a question, that in Jewish mystical tradition, we speak of nothingness as ayin, and we speak of somethingness as yesh, ayin and yesh, form and formless. And one of the profound insights of Nagarjuna, I heard you quoted the Madhyamika, and the great teacher of the middle way, and in our tradition, many of the non-dual thinkers in Jewish tradition, is that even when you've arrived, as it were, at an enlightened state where all form is empty, of absolute inherent existence, what we would say all form is just the play of God. It's the light and the transparency to God is the way that we would say something is empty. Right? Does it have its own inherent existence? We can see the divine in it, would be a way of saying that. Or the divine in us, the chelek Eloham ima, that we each have our own bodhicitta, we have our own inherent, deeply unborn, profound possibility for awakening. There's the other side of it, which is that all form is also that we don't remain in the formless. So a man asked during the Christian Jewish dialogue, Christian Buddhist dialogue, all of these stories get in the way, they divide us. And I wanted to respond then to him, but it wasn't my place to respond. I'll say now, is that to say that we could do without divisions is equally ignorant as it is to say that we are all, divided in an ultimate sense. That even an enlightened individual will come back and say, oh, a table has real qualities, even if they're not inherently real. Right? So that Buddhists, I would ask you, the Buddha taught impermanence, but he didn't teach that we would rid ourselves of Buddhism. Someone can say, I'm a Buddhist. So the relationship between story and non-story, the relationship between I'm beyond all of the labels, and yet I'm also fully inside all of the labels. How does that, for all of them, in terms of how do they hold being a Buddhist?
So, another very, very important question, important part, that is, it is true. From the Buddhist point of view, when you look at what is ultimately the ultimate mode of being, what is the ultimate reality? What is that you do say that everything is in one taste of emptiness. That is but that is not to say that everything is one. You have to understand this dual reality, if you will. It's called the two truths, conventional and the ultimate. These are the two sides of the same coin. You can say that everything is relative or dependently existing. Another way of saying that is everything is devoid of having independent status. So something that is dependent cannot be independent. That something that exists independent on cause and conditions is devoid of being independent status. So from that perspective, the Buddhists would see that like the samsara nirvana, the salvation or this transcendence and our samsaric, the ordinary state of suffering, the continuous suffering. These are actually in one taste in the sense that both of these don't exist inherent in fixed objective way. Everything has this two nature. On the one hand, it can be understood only in context. That means that nothing exists outside of that context and relationship. Attaining the Buddhahood is the fully realizing that. But as you said that, participating in this reality of absence of interdependence actually means that everything that we see is designated. It is, it exists nominally. It exists conventionally. It exists conceptually. Not outside of where we can. In other words, things don't exist outside of the mind, if you will. Everything is designated by the mind itself, or labeled by the words. Now, that doesn't mean that the plurality of approaches, like the religious approach and so forth, need to be kind of dismantled, and just to think that it's one reality, one truth, that's it. Not like that. As His Holiness the Dalai Lama often mentions that on the one level, the metaphysical level, there are many different traditions. The metaphysics is also the kind of creation of the mind, and that there are many different minds. So there are different metaphysical positions. Whether those metaphysical positions have any kind of validity or not, that's not the point. I think that people who do believe or who do resonate with certain philosophical, metaphysical position, and then if they find through such metaphysical assumptions and beliefs ways to transform their own hearts and minds, then that's a particular metaphysical position's belief. It's useful, and from that perspective, all the major religions are very useful, very important.
Are good tools towards that end.
Good towards promoting well-being,
yes.
Promoting peace.
And what did the teacher say about the bowl?
So like this ball, that was the dual nature part of it.
Okay.
Like this ball, we can't say that it doesn't exist, but it exists, not also in a fixed, independent manner. Yes. That ball exists in a context. It has the different parts and so forth and so on.
Yes.
And then we label it as a ball. And in that sense, the ball exists. It functions to,
yes.
ring. And so it performs certain functions, but not in an a priori sense. I mean, to borrow Hume's slide.
So I've gotten into trouble in New York and in other places where I've said, and by the way, this is the segue into all of your questions, so please get ready. And if you're sleeping, that's great. It's a good morning practice to allow whatever is happening here to go through you on an unconscious level. But I've said that if Judaism were to disappear, it wouldn't be a problem. If Judaism were to disappear, I would be sad. If Christianity were to disappear, I would be sad. If Buddhism were to disappear, I would be sad, because they're beautiful. But as the Buddha's beautiful raft metaphor, the point is to get across from one side to the other. And if Judaism and other religious traditions are to be judged, they're to be judged by their skillful capacity, their upaya, or their ability to bring people from one side of suffering to the side of freedom. And so all of the practices, whether it's Shabbat, or it's mitzvot, or all of the Jewish practices that are our kind of yoga for the mind and for the heart, are pointing in that direction. And more often than not, in the Jewish world, the conversation, I don't know how many people here are identify Jewishly, but more often the conversation is how to solidify our identity as Jews and not to soften the heart and to engage in a practice that opens us to the world. And so I think that the mystical element of Judaism is in a deep dialogue. The mystical traditions are in a deep dialogue because they see that all of the religious traditions are mind forms that are beautiful, that are skillful, but the goal is to reach it to the other side. So with that, maybe we can open up some questions from... maybe I would love Geshe to...
Question,
yeah.
And this
You're going to ask me a question. Okay, great.
Well, it's not, and my question is not a profound and difficult one. Just
simple. Keep it simple.
Simple one. I've heard so many times this term called the JewBooze.
JewBooze, yeah.
Yes. There are a lot of JewBooze, right? How do you relate to that?
How do I relate to JewBooze? So
Yes,
I think Geshe is asking us, there's a phenomenon in America called JewBooze, or Jews who are also Buddhists, or Boo-Jews, right? Have you heard of this? Or sometimes they call them Hu-Jews if they're Hindus. If they're Sufis, they're Su-Jews. I mean, they have a lot of... Yeah, I think what people are saying is, like I said in the beginning, that there were parts of the Buddhist tradition, many parts, that because of the Buddha's beginning was with the self. The Buddha's beginning was with inquiry into the inner place, the dissolution of the separate self-sense or the notion that the self was at all. And I think that for many spiritual seekers who wanted a Judaism that was more about experience and about personal illumination. I think there were Jews in the generation, maybe not my parents' generation, but those who were maybe boomers, baby boomers, a little bit younger than my parents, a little bit older than me. Like this generation became seekers who went to temples, and instead of having this deep inner place explored, they felt as if they had to read a creed or they had to say prayers that they didn't really understand. And I think for that generation of seekers, Buddhism became a very direct path to the term ta'amu ur'u ki tov Adonai, which is taste and see that there is nothing but that suchness, that divine suchness. And they wanted that. And then once having that experience in Buddhism, they said, I wonder if there's a Jewish way to do this, because I was born Jewish after all, and I have that. And so many of them returned or tried to combine that place, Judaism and Buddhism. Some didn't, some don't really, for them it's just a vehicle. Sharon Salzberg and Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield and all of the famous Jewish Buddhists who aren't JewBooze because they do Judaism and Buddhism together, but they're JewBooze because they identify as having, as Krishna Das said, he's Jewish on his parents' side. So they feel Jewish on their parents' side, and they want to find a way, but they're still in the Buddhist world, and very deeply in the Buddhist or in the Hindu world. And I think there was a great thinker who said that the 21st century will have to be a mystical century, or it won't be at all. It will have to be a mystical century, or it won't be. And I think that he was pointing to that deep place, which is the possibility of awakening beyond the forms and then to hold the forms differently.
Also I think, so that's from the Jewish side to kind of resonate with the Buddhist tradition, I guess. For the Tibetans, also, I think there is also a very deep sense of resonance with the Jewish community, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama, often talks about, because of this kind of shared reality of diaspora. In fact, in the 60s, His Holiness sent some Tibetans in Israel to learn the secrets of how to survive as people. As Tibetans are being persecuted by the Chinese communists. So on that level also, I think that, at least from the Tibetan side, that they see a great kind of this, resonance with the Jewish community. And for example, if you go to Dharamsala, where His Holiness lives now, and the Tibetan exile government is, there are so many Jews, for so many Israelis, they come there every year. There's even a town that is the Jewish town now. Yes, so it's I think that shared reality also is of diaspora is also one that kind of connects the two people, the Tibetans and the Jews also. Anyway, please, yeah.
I think it's on the path of the discussion. When we study any of the world's spiritualities, the philosophies are beautiful, right? I think every single one that I've studied, the philosophies are beautiful, but sometimes they can get lost in practice, and sometimes the philosophy or the practice becomes, as you were saying, we identify with very specific things that aren't necessarily in line with the philosophy. And as Buddhism is rising, we are becoming more aware of Buddhist practice and the Jewish mysticism, even Christianity. I'm wondering if you have thoughts or advice as to how we can protect the beauty of the philosophy in practice and not let the beauty get lost in the practices it can become. Because I think in some cases, some of the conflicts in this world spirituality is when we've misinterpreted the philosophy and we've come so hard against the practice that the practices clash. But if you dig into the root of the philosophy, you actually find they're at one. I wonder if you have thoughts there.
So maybe we can take a couple of questions and then we'll try to circle back to each of the questions. I'll hold that one and maybe ask if we can pile a couple of questions on, and then I'll try, and maybe Geshe and the monks can also, because I also know that the energy in the room, we're going to be praying the Jewish prayers, don't worry, it's coming in about 15 minutes, yeah.
So speaking about Jewish prayer, we have a concept called hitbodedut, which is to pray within oneself or for oneself, very similar in the way I see it in meditation. But we also have, equally as important, this concept that we pray alone within a prayerful community. And the power that we all have by praying together, the support that we get as a prayerful community is very much interwoven within our tradition. So I was wondering, do you have a similar sense of not only that sense of prayer alone, but also within the context of a prayerful community?
Let's take one more question and we'll come back. Anyone else? There?
I have a really simple question based on what everybody else has said. I'm really interested in learning what is on the wall and what is the symbolism.
Okay. So I think that David or someone else will have to actually explain that, or if it's Lexi will explain that. I think let's just be honest let's have honest conversation about different religious traditions and philosophies for 2 minutes. It's not true that every religious and philosophical tradition is by definition enlightened. There are elements of almost every tradition. I'm sure that I'll speak first because I'll show you mine, maybe you'll show me yours. There are elements of the Jewish tradition that are ugly. There are elements of the Jewish tradition, the biblical tradition, that are misogynist. There are elements of the Jewish tradition that are racial. There are elements of the Jewish tradition that are non-sex positive. There are elements of the Jewish tradition that are anti-other. There are those voices in the tradition, and every tradition, as far as I know, has elements of that to some degree. The hallmark of a tradition that is compelling to me is a tradition that recognizes the historicity or the conditions in which a tradition is born and allows for that tradition to continue to evolve, to be impermanent in its absolute nature, to continue to evolve and to change and to become better and to become clearer. And to that extent, I remember hearing the Dalai Lama say that if science were to come and disprove elements of Buddhist philosophy, that he would be compelled to change. He wouldn't go so far as to say that there would be a fourth turning of the wheel, but there would be changes. He would defer. And I think that the Jewish tradition has done that as well. And so I think that there are always going to be strata of different people who interpret the tradition at different levels. And the level that I hope that people both practice and think at is a level which does the most benefit for the most number of sentient beings in the universe. And I think that where we are today is that we're moving in that direction in all of the traditions. And I think that to the extent that a philosophy is very, very limited, you will have practice that is limited. But as the philosophy grows in its understanding, the practices will have to keep up. And so if you profess, and this is a big piece of my ministry, if you say that the Bible says love your neighbor as yourself, and you have no practice that expresses that, then how do you implement it? You implement it with fear, you implement it with law, with rules. We have to have, and those are important because they're skillful, right? A law is there to remind us when we're not in that holy place to act in a holy way. It's almost, law is in that way, it's a postcard from a place you once visited that can remind you of what it was like there, even when you don't feel like you want to go. But we want to be in that place, and so we need practices, and that will change in synagogues and mosques. We have to have practices that are in alignment with our philosophy. And I'll just say the last thing, I'll say the second question about Hitbodedut and about Sangha. I know that you were directing to the Buddhist. I was thinking the same question, which is, how do we stop Buddhism from being used narcissistically? For people to go into themselves and say, it's my bliss. You know, this morning's metta meditation was such a beautiful, to say may I and then to say may you is that fulcrum. May I, may you, may we. So that's my answer. I don't know what Geshe and the monks will say.
I'll talk about the second one briefly, but the first, as to the first question, it's true that, you know, the philosophy, what can be called, in Sanskrit is called drishti, or the tawa in Tibetan, the view, a perspective. Philosophy is basically a view, a perspective, a certain stance on whether it's God, whether it's whatever position that we hold. The view or the perspective shapes our emotional response. You know, that is true. But at the same time, one can also be very dogmatic about the philosophy, and that's where that we can become, you know, lost with our practice, and then you know, then comes it, you know, when the ideologies, you know, take over, and we forget that we all want to be happy and to be free from suffering. That's why that when Buddha was approached, you know, consistently by several people asking these philosophical questions. Some of these you can't really talk about. You know, that it's how do you talk? So Buddha was asked what's actually in 64 of those. They had come down to, you know, the 14, kind of summarized into 14. But then if even further, it can be summarized in 4. But basically, that when Buddha was asked, you know, questions about, you know, what is there a beginning and end to the universe and the sentient life or the living being? You know, if there is a soul, the self that is same or the separate from the what is called the aggregates, the processes and so forth. If the self is permanent or impermanent, you know, that in when he was asked this, he actually, many times he remained silent, you know, that no comment. That's not that he didn't have something to say, you know, we all have something to say, you know, but what he saw was that, you know, these questions sometimes can be not that constructive. You have to be more practical, and that's why that he And then when finally this person got so irritated, he said that I've been, studying with you for all these years, and I asked this question, you never answered this. And then Buddha tells him that, have I asked you to come to find all these kind of metaphysical answers, or something practical? What would you do if someone comes to you and who is shot with an arrow? Are you going to ask that where this arrow came from? What kind of wood? What kind of minerals kind of produce this wood? And who made and all those things? Or do you need to remove the arrow and start, the healing? And that's what the point he was making was that you have to be practical, kind of at the level of practical. So suffering is true. There are suffering that we have emotional, physical. When we need to look at what kind of our attitude, what kind of our behavior, what kind of our actions, contribute to those suffering, and how do we go about healing those? So I think that we need to find a balance between the philosophy and the practice. Now, as for the balancing, then personal salvation, personal transformation, or the freedom from this suffering, and also to attending to others, compassion, and so forth. That's where that I think compassion is the key. The understanding that suffering is something that everyone wants to avoid, and if we put our own personal practice in overcoming our own anguish as a way, understanding our own suffering as a way, or as a window into understanding others also, then we will, see that common humanity, that others as one of us, and therefore would not be lost in one's own kind of solitary, pursuit of enlightenment like that. The power of collective kind of practice is certainly recognized in Buddhist tradition. That's what the Sangha, the community, comes. Sangha is, in fact, that Buddha said that whether his teachings remain or not need to be, judged by the presence of the Sangha, meaning the community of practitioners. Because doing it together, we find inspiration. The Sangha is like the people. It's like our support group. Even if we are people, let's say that people, struggling with the loss of children, or so, when you have other people that come together and then you spend time to talk, and that support group is a very healing process. Same thing for the practice also. The Sangha, the group practice, is seen as very helpful for personal practice, but also that as a communally kind of strengthening some of these values that we value. Thank you so much. And
Lexi,
as
can you
for the last
explain
one,
the mandala?
This is a beautiful symbol, and Catherine Ann and Tom Ward could tell you more about it. But for years and years, we had a cross here, but the chapel has evolved spiritually, and Nicholas has, really been instrumental in that happening. So he's exploring and sharing with us the mystical aspects of Christianity and incorporates that. So we felt a need to take down a cross and put this beautiful symbol, and they can give you the details. And yes, can you tell the details? Okay, oh, you texted me.
So the philosophy behind this is that it's a Trinitarian mandala representing the earth and the threefold creative action of the spirit.
Beautiful. So I think that we're gonna actually have to come to a close here, but I would love to chant with the monks. I would love to chant with them, and maybe we can all sit up and get some energy. It's been a wonderful opportunity to just touch on so many areas that we share and are in dialogue, areas that I still would love to have conversations for another time, put a little mezuzah on this door for later, to come back to the tension between a contemplative tradition and social action, and how America has changed Tibetan Buddhism, because America has changed every religion that has ever come here. We're going to put that for some, maybe New York dialogue, or maybe some other time we'll be here. And I just wanted to chant a simple chant. The word shalom has been a very big word this weekend, and I spoke about it last night in my sermon about the power of shalom, of peace. And in the mystical tradition of Judaism, the word shalom is broken into two words, shalom or shel-aim, which means of the mother. Aim is mother, and Om is one of the sacred symbols in our tradition as well, not just in the Hindu or in the Sanskrit, but Om is from the word Homeh Libi, which means my heart is Omeh. There's a signal that my heart sends out and the universe sends back and says yes. The yes-ing to each other, mutual yes-ing. So it's a simple chant that's probably not nearly as old as the chanting we were doing this morning, but I heard this from a great singer named Shlomo Carlebach, and I'll do it once and maybe the monks will join in. Yeah?
Shalom, sena shalom, tinti kunat di jugi, na sunga suru redwal, odi inge di tsik di shidel, la kuwa resa, odi ngat Quran tang but, ani ngat nyam tu chene, ngat sama nyam tu tang bos.
Shalom, 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 shalom. May the one who makes peace bring peace to all sentient beings. May there be shalom, of home, of connection for all beings everywhere. And let us say Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi Ingber, and for this wonderful conversation with the monks here, and thank you all for coming here for this event. I'd like to thank the Aspen Center for Living Peace, the Aspen Chapel for having the monks here, and particularly, on behalf of not only these 11 monks here, but over 3,000 monks that are back in India at Drepung Loseling Monastery. I'd like to thank Lexi Potamkin and Robert Potamkin and the family for bringing us here all these years. We go back in 1997 or so, and for all these years, for your love, for your support, and we really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you.